So in a normal energy project, when the price drops too much, they shut in production.
Right.
And then they restart it later. And no one likes to do that. It costs something, it costs time, and you're not getting income in the meantime, but it can be done. But you can't do that in the Russian permafrost. If the crude stops moving through the permafrost layer for any reason, it freezes into gel, and the water that comes up as a byproduct freezes into ice. And when water turns into ice, it expands and it pops the pipe from the inside. What's going on right now is the insurance ban on Russian vessels on January 1 will expand to any vessel carrying any Russian cargo. And at the same time, the Europeans are about to enact their ban, saying that no Russian crude whatsoever can be sold by any boat to any European market. And that is going to force a degree of shut-in the ports. The pressure will build back up to the wells, and then the wells will freeze solid. That's going to happen pretty quick. And since the demand for energy tends to be inelastic, you get an outsized price response. So assuming for the moment that all else is equal, and I realize that is never true, you remove 4 million barrels a day of Siberian output, and you're going to get $180 oil. Now, since then, the Chinese look like they're going out of their way to experience an economic crisis. And if we see a drastic decrease in their ability to absorb crude, that's going to change the price forecast. There's so much in motion right now, but none of it is great. I like companies that center their production and their sales in North America because we've got the highest value-added labor system between Mexico and the United States, and we produce where we sell for the most part. Also, if the product is demographically driven in terms of its demand profile, I like that. And if the end product is very energy intensive for its production, because we have the cheapest electricity and energy in the world, that's great. And if the end product is exportable, that's kind of like my trifecta. And so agricultural processing, petrochemicals, things like that are most of my portfolio. Since the Ukraine war started, I have gotten into commodities in a very big way, but I will caution you that most players in most commodity markets are truly global, and you want to make sure you are not exposed to Ukraine or Russia or Brazil, because the Russian system is fallen apart, the Ukrainian system is unlikely to come back, and Brazil is dependent upon material inputs that come from Russia. So you've got to be very, very careful where you're putting your money in that space, or you're going to get exposed to all the bad along with the good. I don't have the data in front of me, but on the whole, roughly 40 to 50% of Brazilian fertilizer inputs are sourced from the former Soviet Union, and most of the remainder is either China or the Middle East. So, there's no version of this picture that looks good for Brazil. Most of the economic growth that the world, not the US, the world has experienced since 1990 is that we've brought in an empire worth of raw materials from the Russian space, and we've brought in 1 billion workers from the Chinese space. And the outputs from both of those systems have allowed Brazil to bloom in a way that it never could before. We're now seeing all of that in reverse. And if you remove a lot of the added fertilizer that's come into the situation, then the 2.5 billion people that we have added since 1990 are in some very real danger. Because Brazil is the world's second largest agricultural exporter. Russia is the world's largest exporter of wheat. Ukraine is number 5. And Chinese capital has been part of what's made this all work. And we've seen an increase of the Chinese lifespan by over 40%, 50% since 1990. These things are all linked together. And when you take away the food supply that has allowed all of this to happen, we get to a very dark place very, very quickly. And you cannot replace fertilizer supplies quickly. Nitrogen and phosphate take a minimum of 3 years. Potash usually takes 10. And so far, we've only lost roughly 1/3 of the former Soviet Union's output of this stuff. And that has already been enough for almost every producer in the world to have gone through all of their reserves. The only reason we're not in a food crisis already is because people had reserves, and Mother Nature was very, very kind to us this past year. There's no way we're going to repeat that next year. We're in this weird situation where the Biden administration is trying to provide letters of comfort to point out to financiers and shippers that these things are not under sanctions in order to limit the damage. But if you're a financial house and you see these sanctions getting tighter and tighter and tighter, and with every new genocide that the Russians propagate, you got to wonder whether you want to be affiliated at all. So most, to this point, of the reduction in fertilizer shipments, roughly 1/3, has been because companies don't want to touch it, not because they're under sanction. What's going to happen in the next year is we're starting to see industrial accidents in a lot of these places because most of the technology, most of the infrastructure that produces this stuff dates back to the 60s. And it's only been held together since 1990 with Western duct tape and technical work and people shoehorning parts into it. That's not happening anymore. So in the natural gas sector, we're literally seeing explosions at gas processing facilities that you can see from space. And fertilizers, in many ways, is a derivative of petrochemicals, especially for nitrogen. And because natural gas is caught up in the Russia-European mix, the Europeans have stopped making it at all. So it's not all just a direct interruption of Russian and Belarusian shipments. So we're seeing pressure throughout the entire supply chain in the former Soviet and European space. And we're only at the beginning of that.
Europe gears up to send Western tanks to Ukraine. The Western alliance.
The recent tensions in Ukraine have sparked concerns about the potential for military intervention from European nations. Reports have surfaced that European countries, particularly those in the West, are preparing to send tanks and other military equipment to Ukraine in the event of a conflict with Russia. This move would be a significant escalation in the ongoing tensions between Ukraine and Russia, which have been simmering for years. The situation began to heat up in 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea from Ukraine. Since then, there have been sporadic clashes between Ukrainian and Russian military forces, as well as an ongoing conflict in the eastern regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. The potential for European military intervention in Ukraine is a worrying development, as it could lead to a larger and more destructive conflict. The presence of tanks and other heavy military equipment on the ground would greatly increase the firepower available to the Ukrainian military, making it more likely that they could hold off any Russian aggression. However, it's important to note that the tanks and other equipment being sent to Ukraine are defensive in nature and are meant to help strengthen Ukraine's ability to defend itself. It's not an aggressive move by European countries. It is also worth mentioning that the move is not only a response to the current tensions in Ukraine, but also a response to the increased military activity by Russia in the region. The Russian military has been conducting large-scale exercises near the Ukrainian border and has amassed a significant number of troops in the area. This has raised concerns among European nations that Russia could be planning to launch an invasion of Ukraine. Overall, while the deployment of tanks and other military equipment to Ukraine may seem like a dangerous escalation in the ongoing tensions between Ukraine and Russia, it is important to understand that it is a defensive move by European nations to help Ukraine protect itself. It is not an aggressive move, and is meant to serve as a deterrent to any potential Russian aggression. It is important to keep an eye on the situation and watch for any developments, as the situation in Ukraine is fluid and can change rapidly. We hope for peace and stability in the region, and that diplomatic solutions can be found to resolve the ongoing tensions between Ukraine and Russia.